We have Melanie and Suzanne online with me, also from Copenhagen, I think. Maybe we'll start with just if you can introduce yourself. Melanie, would you like to tell a little bit about who you are and what you do at the agency?
Yes, thank you very much, Antti. So I've been at the agency for quite a while now, and I am in the group on climate, energy and transport, and I'm working on greenhouse gas data assessments and greenhouse gas emission reviews, and I'm part of the team preparing the Trends and Projections report. Additionally, I am also coordinating the agency's environmental management system. Yeah.
Very nice to have you, Melanie. And Suzanne, what about you?
Good afternoon, Nancy. Thanks. I'm also working on climate change and energy in the same group as Melanie. And I'm working across the agency's portfolio on these topics, mostly on the systems that we use to collect data, but also on how we communicate them. I'm working as well across the boundaries of climate change mitigation and circular economy to look at the co-benefits of actions in both areas. And then finally, and most relevant for this Facebook Live, I'm coordinating the Trends and Projections report development.
Nice to have you too, Suzanne. And you both mentioned the EEA's Trends and Projections report, which is very much in the focus of our today's Facebook Live. Can you tell a little bit about that report, what it is about, and when do we publish it? And I think, Suzanne, you can maybe tackle this one.
Yes, for sure. The Trends and Projections report is an annual report from the EEA. The most recent one was published in the end of November last year. The report has been published each year since the early 2000s, with really the simple, it's developed to respond to the simple question, are we on track to our climate targets? And to be able to answer the question, are we on track, you have to look on one hand at the historical developments or the trends, and on the other hand, the future expectations or the projections. The early years of the report, we looked specifically at greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And then over the last 8 or so years, the report is also looking at progress on renewable energy deployment, as well as improved energy efficiency, because these two areas are really, really critical for greenhouse gas emissions reductions and climate policy overall. As time has gone, the report's looking further and further into the future as we have new targets. So this year, or this past report, we looked at the 2020 targets, the 2030 targets, but also the 2050 goals. The report looks at the EU, the EU 27 member countries, both at EU level, but also what's happening in the individual countries, as well as a number of additional EEA member countries. And then finally, it's really important to note that we do the work to prepare the Trends and Projections report together with the European Topic Center on climate mitigation and energy. So we're actually quite a big team developing this report with lots of expertise from different areas.
It is indeed a very heavy package of data and analysis, and we have a wide network working on that. Suzanne, you mentioned the EU's climate targets. Maybe we can start from those. If Melanie, maybe you can explain a little bit to our viewers, what are those targets exactly, and how they are set, and what are the timelines and so on.
So we have EU targets for 3 years, for 2020, 2030 and 2050. And these are the ones that are assessed in the Trends and Projections report, as Suzanne just said. So for 2020, the EU climate and energy objectives were the so-called 20-20-20 targets, where we have a 20% greenhouse gas reduction compared to 1990, which is the base year that we always use as a reference. Then the second target was to increase the share of renewable energy sources to 20% in the EU. And the third was to improve the energy efficiency by 20%. And for 2030, the objectives are a little bit more ambitious. So we have at least 40% greenhouse gas reduction, again, compared to 1990, 32% share of renewable energy sources and 32.5% improvement of energy efficiency. It is important to note that at this moment, there are ongoing discussions to increase the emission reduction target for 2030 to at least 55% or even 60%. And this would help achieve the EU's long-term target for 2050, which is to become the first climate neutral continent, according to the Green Deal, to the European Green Deal. So,
and when do we get clarity on what the targets for the 2030 will be finally?
Hopefully soon. So this will be a priority under the Portuguese presidency at the moment. So I think there are still the talks outstanding, the trialogue with the parliament, and the parliament was actually pushing for the minus 60%. But I wouldn't speculate any further, but we hope that the reduction number target will be agreed soon and then will appear in the European climate law.
That's very good. I think at this point, I'd like to remind our viewers that you're welcome to ask questions from our experts. You can do that in the Facebook comments, or if you're following here on Twitter, you can just tag us and ask a question about what's on your mind about the EU's progress towards these climate and energy targets. And Melanie just explained what the goals are. Now maybe we go into our trends and projections analysis. Suzanne, can you tell us if we are on track to achieve those targets, or how is the progress?
Sure. If I start with the 2020 targets, it's looking quite good, actually. As of 2019, the EU 27 member countries had achieved greenhouse gas emissions reductions of 24% below 1990 levels. So that means compared to the goal of reducing by 20%, that we've already in 2019 overachieved the target for emissions reductions. And so that's a really good data point, I think, also when we start looking at 2030 and the ambition levels there. For renewable energies, or for renewable energy deployment in 2020, the target was, as Melanie said, 20%. And as of 2019, in the EU 27 countries, we were at 19.4%. So really quite close to the target. And based on the average trajectory, the average annual change that we've seen since 2005, we can expect that last 0.6% is achieved by the end of 2020, so that then also that target would be achieved. On energy efficiency, the reductions in energy consumption unfortunately haven't been on track. In most recent years, we've seen energy consumption stabilizing or falling slightly depending on which parameters you look at, but not enough to achieve the 20% reduction. I should mention, though, that these numbers I'm quoting are from 2019, and they're not yet taking into account the effects of what happened in 2020, the effects of the pandemic and the lockdown and the really significant changes in the economy in Europe. So we could imagine an acceleration in some of the factors last year, potentially even for energy efficiency, bringing the target into reach at the last moment. The report, the Trends and Projections report, also goes into achievements at member state level. Melanie introduced the EU level targets. There's also for member states targets that they also are set to achieve. Some of them are binding and some of them are national non-binding. But in general, I can really quickly give a bit of insight, if you like, to some of those member state achievements. For the effort sharing targets, which is greenhouse gas emissions reductions that are nationally binding in the member states. In 2019, 7 member states had already achieved their 2020 target. And those were France, Greece, Italy, Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, and the United Kingdom before Brexit. For renewable energy, in 2019, we had 13 member states already exceeding their 2020 targets. So also well on track there in about half of the member states. And then for energy efficiency, we had about 9 member states on track. So that's also underlying the general EU progress. One additional area that I could mention is the EU emissions trading system, which is not defined in national terms, but it's an EU-wide trading system. And there also, we've been really well on track. Last year's assessment showed that compared to the target to reduce emissions in that area of 20%, there was a realized reduction of about minus 33% in the EU 27. So also in that area, the emissions reductions have been well in line with the targets.
So for the targets that were set for 2020, it looks positive. What if we look at the trajectory towards 2030? There's some uncertainty about the final goals, but there, what's the outlook right now?
If we stick to the original 40% reduction, which is currently the legislated one, while the at least 55% or 60% is being looked at. Member states last year submitted national energy and climate plans that describe how they intend to achieve the 2030 targets, but also setting their ambitions and national contributions for renewable energy deployment, energy efficiency, and so on until 2030. And the EU Commission, the European Commission has aggregated these NECPs, and it looks there like the 40% reduction in emissions is within reach. The national projections that the EEA has collected show a slight reach to get to the 40%, but those projections will be updated in just a couple of months. For renewable energy in 2030, to reach this target that Melanie was mentioning, we would have to see a pace of growth every year of about 1.1% across the EU until 2030. And that's compared to the growth that we've seen since 2005 of about 0.7%. So the deployment of renewable energy would have to accelerate, but even more substantially to reach the 32.5% improvement in energy efficiency, we'd be talking approximately a doubling of the annual progress that we've made since 2005. So a bit more hard work there done.
So in a nutshell, we can say that the 2020 targets look achievable. In some cases, we have already achieved those, but towards 2030, we clearly see that more efforts are needed, and indeed we expect that to happen over the next 10 years. I think this is maybe a good point. This is sort of a very top-level view on the EU level and to some extent on the member states level, but we have some questions on Facebook, and this is maybe something that we have heard before, but it's a tricky one to answer. But I'll ask it to you anyway. Andrea is asking first, what can I personally contribute to climate change mitigation? So what can we do as individuals? But then there's a related question. Theresia is asking, does this individual action make any difference? I know that you're analyzing this from a different perspective, where we look at the data we receive from member states. But what's your personal take on this?
I can give it a shot first, Susanne, if that's fine. So first of all, of course, individual action is crucial, even if we don't feel like that it would be. But all the policies and regulations and the EU policy that we were talking about will only work together with citizens who are prepared and willing to carry them through, because it will have a great influence on our lifestyle if we, with a view to 2050 and to the climate neutrality. And I think the most impactful measures that we have, or that we we can do individually is to adopt our lifestyles already in the right direction, meaning to, for example, travel less by plane or cycle more or use an electric car if we have to have a car. So that was my take on this. If you want to contribute, Suzanne.
Sure. I think I can only echo Melanie's words that, of course, individual contributions make a really big difference. And the actions of each of us sum up to the kinds of progress that we've seen over recent years, and that national policies are supporting and making possible. In addition to transport and mobility that Melanie suggested, I would also say that consumption patterns also have a really big impact on the climate footprint, if you will, of each of us. And thinking things in like embodied emissions of transportation, of what we consume on an everyday basis, that really does make a difference in the long term. So I think also there's an important point. One other that I could mention from some of the work on circular economy that I've done is looking at buildings and the consumption of energy in buildings, and renovation of buildings, renovation of homes, insulation of homes to improve the heating and cooling energy use is another area where individuals can make a difference in their own environment. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks very much. We have a few questions on different economic sectors, but maybe we'll start with a broader overview about there's a split in this EU climate targets between the EU emissions trading ETS emissions and then the effort sharing emissions. Maybe Melanie, you can explain a little bit about that split, but then also we can go into the different sectors and how the progress has been. It's maybe not even across different economic sectors.
Sure. So the emission trading system and the effort sharing legislation are the two of the EU's key policy instruments for cutting greenhouse gas emissions. So firstly, the ETS covers emissions from large-scale power and industry sectors, as well as from the aviation sector, while the effort sharing legislation covers smaller non-ETS industry, the housing sector, agriculture, waste management, and transport. And the emissions in those two areas are controlled in very different ways. So for those, for the ETS, for example, we have an EU joint target. So the emission reductions are achieved through a so-called cap and trade system, where we have industry have to purchase allowances for every ton CO2 that they emit, and the overall amount of allowances gradually decreases over time. In contrast to that, the effort sharing sectors have targets on a member state level, and these are set according to the wealth of the country, so according to the GDP. And you ask about the progress in the different sectors. So well,
yeah,
not surprised.
Maybe between the ETS and the effort sharing sectors, but if you have examples of particular sectors where we are doing very well or maybe not so well, I think that would be interesting.
So there was a very different progress between the ETS and the ESD. We had large emission reductions that occurred in the ETS sector since 2005, in particular related to fossil fuel use. And significant emission reductions have taken place in 2019. So the emissions were 9% lower than in 2018. And this was the largest drop in the decade. So I think important measures to reach that was increased use of renewable energy and the phase out of coal in certain areas. It might be interesting to note that there was just at the end of last year a briefing on the trend of ETS published by the EEA, so that can be found on the website. And for the effort sharing sectors, the progress was much slower, and mainly this was due to the growing transport emissions, but also the drivers and the reduction potentials are very diverse in the effort sharing sectors, and an equally diverse portfolio of measures is needed to reduce the emissions, and it needs to be done at country level. So it's the country's responsibility, which makes it's also a little bit more difficult. So
thanks. Let's follow up on that, because we have actually two questions on the transport sector or on mobility. This is from Danny Ske, asking what are the main solutions to deal with high emissions from the transport sector. And Mori Ono on Facebook is asking about sustainable mobility and what progress has the EU achieved, and also asking if projects under the Horizon 2020 can help EU to achieve its climate targets. I'm not sure if you are, if you know about the projects under Horizon 2020, but let's discuss the transport sector at least. What needs to happen there to speed up the progress to cut emissions?
So for the transport sector, I would say, in view of the long-term target, which is now the climate neutrality by 2050, the most important measure would be the electrification of the entire road transport sector, and in that sense also to make sure that all the electricity is produced by renewable energies, because only then it makes sense. But the transport sector is the one where we have the biggest challenges, because in the past, the largest reductions occurred in other sectors, occurred in the energy supply sectors, in the industry sectors, and also in the building sector and agriculture. We had some reductions, but actually the transport sector was the one that increased since 1990. So there is still a lot to do there.
Definitely. There's one other sector that our viewers are interested in. This is Marina asking about the mining sector. This is also something that maybe we can, if we can find a data source or a link, we can post it in the chat afterwards, unless you can remember any relevant data or source about this sector. If not, then I'll think we'll just move forward. We have more questions on Facebook. Let me just look at them quickly. We covered transport. Then there's a question about the EEA data, and I think we can now go to that part, because there's quite a bit of background work that needs to be done to put the analysis together. There's a lot of we have member states reporting the data to us. Can you explain briefly about how that actually works, and how do we verify the correctness of this data, and why can people basically trust the numbers that we put out?
Sure, I can answer that, Antti. But I can also, maybe to the question about mining and some of the other questions that are coming through. In addition to this ETS briefing that Melanie mentioned that we published in December last year, the agency also in May published a briefing on the trends and drivers in EU emissions that could be interesting. That digs more down into the trends for greenhouse gas emissions across Europe, and that might also be an interesting data source to dig down. I'm sorry that we don't have mining specifically in the scope of the trends and projections report. But for the data that we use for the report, we bring together about 15 to 20 different data sets in the trends and projections report, and use them together to develop the analyses and the assessments that the report includes. The majority of the data are reported to the EEA from the member states and EEA member countries, as you were mentioning, Antti. And the way that these data are to be reported is specified in legislation. So there's a standard template, there's a standard methodology, there's descriptions of how the data should be formatted and submitted. And we have a reporting system at the EEA to collect them. And we also work together closely with the European Topic Center on climate mitigation and energy to run quality assurance and quality control procedures on the data, among other things, looking at what's been submitted before to make sure that what we're receiving is within expected ranges. And then we have a dialogue with member states if there are any surprises or outliers to better understand the data that have been reported. I can also add that for the energy parts of the trends and projections report, we also draw very heavily on data from Eurostat that member states report to Eurostat, and then we build these into our assessment, with the exception of the approximated numbers for 2019, where we look at the expected levels of renewable energy and energy efficiency in 2019, and those are ones that we're putting together at the EEA.
That's very good, and indeed, all these data are and analysis are available through the EEA website, eea.europa.eu, and you look at climate change mitigation as the topic. And they made a comment on Facebook that we shouldn't forget about meat consumption as one of the individual efforts to cut greenhouse gases. I think that's a very good comment. And then we have another question from Theresia, and this is about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The numbers that we have discussed until now have been numbers from 2019, or the latest data. And of course, we know that the pandemic started last year. Do we know anything about its impact on greenhouse gas emissions or any of these targets that we have discussed?
I think that's also an important detail that I didn't include in the question or the answer about data. Because in the reporting cycle, countries have 2 years to finalize their numbers and then report them to us, because it's really complex to put together the greenhouse gas emissions inventories and prepare the numbers. But in addition, there's all these also these approximated inventories that are submitted 1 year later. So for 2020, we don't actually have the numbers reported from across Europe yet. In July, we'll receive for the first time from member states their approximations of what their emissions were last year. And then this data set should be prepared and ready for the autumn, for the next time really that we come out with the trends and projections report. But at the same time as the EEA doesn't have hard data on the effects of the pandemic, the lockdown, and the really substantial changes in the economy last year and still now. We have some numbers. The European Commission, for example, has cited the International Energy Agency, which has estimated about an 8% reduction in emissions last year, as well as the Carbon Monitor, which is a research compendium which has estimated about an 11% drop in the EU 27 in the first half of last year. But we'll see later this year how the reported numbers from member states line up with some of these early estimates.
What about the impact of Brexit? Of course, we're not counting UK emission reductions or other progress in the targets going forward. Has that had any impact on the overall progress of the EU and the sort of the outlook of reaching those targets?
I can just really quickly mention that in this past Trends and Projections report, we have tried to make it really clear what the impact of Brexit has been on both greenhouse gas emissions reductions, on renewable energy deployment, and on energy efficiency gains. Brexit has not affected whether or not we reach the 2020 targets. And indeed, the United Kingdom continues to be a part of the European contributions under the Kyoto Protocol. So we're still working with both EU 27 and EU 28 numbers, and the report provides this. On renewable energy, with or without the United Kingdom, we continue to be on track to the 20% reduction or the 20% renewable energy share in 2020. And the energy efficiency question remains really quite tricky with Brexit or without.
Well, if we look now a little bit in the longer term, the EU has set this target of reaching climate neutrality by 2050, and then we also have the Paris Agreement targets, and at the same time, we need to realize that, of course, the EU emissions are only a slice of the global emissions. Let's start with the 2050 climate neutrality. Where do you see the scope of making further progress in member states? And we had a question also about this: how can we achieve even greater reductions than the 55 or 60% that we're looking at towards 2030? Where's the potential in that?
Yeah, I could take that. It is very clear that it is not only about the climate policy, it is very much also about the change of our individual lifestyles. And it is also clear that small ongoing technological improvements alone are not enough to deliver the change that it's needed. This is why people often refer to a transition to describe the scale of change that is necessary in the way we travel in our cities, how we grow and transport our food, what our diet will be, and so on. And to reach carbon neutrality, as well as drastically reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, we will also need to protect and preserve sinks of CO2, because there will be remaining emissions that we cannot reduce. And we need to make sure that we have, for example, preserved forests that absorb CO2 emissions. And when we go back also to the lifestyle and what changes are necessary there, we said already before that in the transport that electrification is where we want to end up. But until then, we will have a lot of measures that we can take on the way, and there would be investing in public transport, reorganizing road space, and how we see mobility as a system, having increased emission standards and increased the efficiency of vehicles. Also, the energy efficiency maybe of the infrastructure of the rail sector could be improved. So there are, it is important that we start making the investments or the changes as early as possible to achieve where we want to achieve in this transition to the climate neutrality in 2050.
What about the global picture? What is the size of the EU emissions in that sum of all global emissions, and what does the world need to do to achieve the Paris Agreement goals? Maybe Suzanne, you can take this one.
Sure. The EU in the global picture, in 1990 we emitted about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and in 2018 this was down to about 8%. The work at global level is of course taking place in the context of the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol in the past until now, under the UNFCCC. And the way that this is working is that countries or the EU as a bloc are submitting what's called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, that indicate what path we'll take to get to carbon neutrality for the EU in 2050. And the EU has actually submitted in December an updated NDC indicating an intention to reach at least 55% net reductions in greenhouse gases by 2030. And the intention for the EU is that if the more we achieve by 2030, the less steep the curve is going to be between 2030 and 2050. So the kinds of changes that Melanie has been mentioning in all sorts of different sectors, if we start tackling them now and achieve more by 2030, then it's going to be a less steep ride to 2050.
Thanks. I know we have a few more questions, and more questions are coming in on Facebook, but it's our time to wrap up soon. I'll just say that there's a question about Bulgaria and Sofia, and I would encourage maybe to contact the local and national authorities on that one. We'll try to post links and answers to your questions in the chat as much as possible. But before we wrap up, I'd like to maybe end with a note about the future. We discussed the Paris Agreement and the path towards climate neutrality. What you personally, what makes you optimistic about future? What try to say something that makes us others feel so optimistic that we can actually reach these targets.
I can start maybe. I am optimistic about the future, and I think we can see that the international agreements are working. We can see that we have in Europe really high ambitions, and these are embodied in the European Green Deal, in the European climate law. And when we're discussing whether we go for 55 or 60% in 2030, I think it's a really, really positive thing. There's a lot of really good momentum, and I think that momentum creates an opportunity. I think also that the recovery from the COVID pandemic, it also presents an opportunity for recovery in a more sustainable way than our systems were offering up until now. And if we tackle that recovery correctly and ensure that we become more sustainable but also more resilient, then I think we can set ourselves on the path that we need to be for climate neutrality in the long term.
Yes, very good. So apart from what you were just saying, Susanne, the growing ambition in the European policy that we have seen, especially at the end of last year, is really positive. But we also saw a growing awareness for climate and sustainability issues across the society. So young people are increasingly vocal and engaged, and also cities and regions are leading the way at a local level. And I think that's also very positive for the future. So yeah, that's the last words.
I think those are very nice last words for us to finish. We'll be hosting more of these chats. We have topics like energy efficiency and marine environment and other things coming up. So watch this space on EEA's Facebook channel or on Twitter, or go to our website and see what we're publishing. Thanks to our two experts, Melanie and Susanne, today, and thanks to everybody who's been watching and asking questions. I hope to see you soon again. So have a good afternoon, and bye from Copenhagen.